Hey patrons, welcome back to another tutorial series. In this series we're going to be working on drawing this elephant and landscape using charcoal, and for this I am using the Arches hot pressed watercolour paper, and I'm going to be using General's charcoal pencils and a charcoal block. So first thing that I want to do is go through what materials I'm using. So for the highlights I'm going to be using a kneaded eraser and a Tombow mono eraser. This one is more detailed for the more detailed highlights, and then this one is for more like general areas where I want to lighten it up, and it also is great for lightening up your sketch outline. So I normally go in with this at the start just to lift up any dark areas for our initial sketch outline. Also, the sketch outline is attached for you guys so that you can follow along with this if you want to start with an accurate sketch and you don't want to draw your own, you just want to quickly transfer something on and get onto the lesson. Otherwise, I do have lots of tutorials where I go through different methods for getting an accurate sketch outline to start off with. If you go onto the post section, on the left hand side you will see a series of tags, and there will be one called sketching tutorials, and if you click on that you can see the tutorials there. So for blending, I'm actually only going to be using brushes today. So I've got a series of different brushes. You can see I've got some round brushes, a smaller one and a larger one. These are the Daler Rowney Aqua Fine in sizes 4 and 26. And I've also got a filbert brush, which is a flatter brush, and this is just size 6. Again, Daler Rowney, this is a sable filbert brush. Normally I would be using my shorter one, but at the moment that's got coloured pencil on it. I used it to blend out some coloured pencil, so I'm using this clean one instead. So as for the pencils, I'm only actually going to be using two different pencils, both by General's, and the first one is a 2H, so this is for our lighter areas, plus because it's harder, because it's a 2H, that means that it is harder and so it's better for detailed work. And also a 2B pencil, which is softer and darker, so it's better for those shadows. As you can see from the reference, this is quite an intense image. There's a lot of dark black tones, and this drawing is really going to be about teaching you guys contrast, getting in the dark values, as well as key and core techniques. And so I will be using a charcoal block. This is just a soft charcoal block, and we're going to be using this for those darkest areas. Blocks are really good because they help you cover a large area very quickly, and then blending with brushes just gives you that really soft look, so that will be really good for the sky. So before we actually start, let me run through the general gist of how I'm going to approach this drawing, because I think it's really important to learn and kind of plan out how you even want to tackle a drawing in the first place. What process are you going to go through rather than just starting? Think about how you want to approach it. With my charcoal drawings, I tend to work from the top to the bottom, purely because if I'm working at the bottom and then I go further up, I might smudge it with my hand. So I'm going to work from top to bottom as I apply this first layer of charcoal. That is to help prevent the smudging. When I work, I tend to get in the darkest values first, so I like to get in the basic structure and go in with my darker charcoal pencil and my block, and I just like to go through and map out the darkest points. So for example, you can see that a lot of the sky is very dark, so I'll be going in with my block and just basically shading in those core shadows. I will leave the mid-tone areas and the highlighted areas white. I just want to map in the darkest areas to start with. I always find that when you map in the darkest areas first, it really helps you to judge your other values, because it can be very difficult. And have you ever seen those illusions where you see two values and one looks darker than the other, but they're actually the same value, but just because they have different values around them, it makes them look different? Well, I find that's the case if you just got white paper and you start shading the lighter areas. You may think that you're going too dark, and then in reality, if you then add the black next to it, it'll actually look very light, the area that you just thought that you did too dark. So I like to get in the darkest values because I do feel like it helps me judge the lightest values as well. But of course you can build it up from light to dark, it's completely up to you. So like I said, first we'll be blocking everything in just with our pencils. I won't be blending as I go. I'll just simply be blocking everything in first. And then I'm going to go in with my brushes and I'm going to start to blend out that charcoal that I've added down. And so I'll start to blend it into those lighter areas just to add tone to them. I don't like adding direct charcoal onto the lightest areas because it gives it too much of a gritty look. Charcoal itself, it's hard to get really light values in, but I really love getting those smooth, very light values by using the brush and just brushing a bit of that excess charcoal over into these lighter areas. So the sky and the background is going to be very soft. Obviously there's a lot of detail in the actual elephant, so we're going to be going in and getting in all of these little creases to start off with as well, and wrinkles in the trunk and in the ears. And there's a lot of heavy shadow on the elephant, so we're really going to go in with some intense shadows. I find that when I'm doing critiques for you guys, it often is the case that most of you are too scared to go dark. So I thought this would be a great reference because it's very, very dark and bold. So let's get into it. I'm going to go in first with my charcoal block, and I'm actually going to wrap a little sheet of tissue paper just around that charcoal block so that my hands don't get really, really dirty because it's very soft. So I'm just going to wrap a little bit around so it's just the tip that's showing, and that's just going to make it much easier and less messy. It's good also if you're using like pastels and you don't like the messiness, just wrap it with a bit of tissue. And I'm going to go in first and start to map out the sky. And like I said, I just want to block in the darkest areas of the sky. And because the block is very soft, it should come off fairly easily. You shouldn't need a lot of pressure to do this. I like to use the side of the block just to get in and cover a larger area faster. I find it more difficult if I use the point. I find it a lot simpler just to use the side of the pencil. And just carefully map out the darkest edges within that sky. Obviously the sky itself is very dark, but I'm just doing this for the darkest pure black areas. I've also taped off the borders for all sides, and that will mean that you get a really nice neat edge when you remove the tape, and it helps just make it a bit cleaner. So you can see that this area just above the elephant is very dark as well. So remember, just the darkest parts. You can use the reference just as reference, but stray a little bit from it and do your own sort of thing. That's fine. And it is very easy to get very messy with this, so just be careful. Try not to rest your hand too much on the drawing. So there's a very big shadow just above the elephant, so I'm pretty much going to be overlapping this all over that area. And I'm trying to go with the direction that the clouds are going in. I'm not just going all around. I'm going to try and follow the sort of direction that we can see each of these clouds are going in. And that will help give it more of a realistic look. Do be careful as you start to approach the elephant. We do want to keep the line quite crisp, and if you go over it, it will be harder to erase. So I'm just being very careful as I get to the actual elephant. But don't worry if you do get a little bit of charcoal on it, especially later when we do our blending out. I'll probably get a bit of charcoal on it. It's easier to erase the charcoal if you've just brushed it on, rather than actually applied it directly with the charcoal stick. So very carefully going around the elephant. For these jet black areas, I will be blending it out with my finger to preserve the really dark values. And then I'll be using a brush to take some of that value and bring some of that value onto the slightly lighter areas. But as you can see, this whole upper layer of the clouds is quite dark until we get to this area. The sound of these isn't that great, so sorry if I'm killing your ears at the moment. Okay, so I'm just going to continue just around the sky. Just outlining and then filling it in. See, as you can see towards the middle there's a slightly lighter patch. So I'm keeping that completely free of any charcoal. So it's not like I'm adding a little bit of charcoal to the slightly lighter areas. It's either adding the charcoal to the jet black areas or not at all. And that's not because we're going to be leaving them white. That's because I want to use the actual brush and brush some of that value onto those areas. I'm just at the moment focusing on the darkest, most jet black areas of the sky to start off with. To be more precise, you can use the block more vertically to use the point. That might give you, it might make it a bit more easier as you go around the elephant. See, already you can see how dramatic this is going to look. And I feel like if you're using the charcoal block, it's so dark, so you can't even be scared to go dark because it's only one value. And just experiment. One of the biggest reasons, like I said, that beginners' work doesn't look realistic is because they're simply not having a good enough contrast there, which means they aren't having a big enough range between their darkest values and their lightest values. They're lacking those really dark values. Okay, just looking, I want to bring this further down. Like I said, you don't have to follow the reference exactly. It doesn't matter if you add in an extra cloud, just follow the general gist of it. But if you want to make some tweaks, if you want to make yours a bit more unique, then by all means go ahead. So adding a little bit of value just for this cloud. But it does get lighter as we go across, so I'm not going to add it the whole way, just right in this corner. Okay. So now I am going to blow away all of the excess powder, otherwise it's going to get everywhere. So I'm just going to give this a quick blow. There we go, that's just going to make it a little less messy. So now I want to do the same thing, but let's go in and let's actually do the elephant and then let's do this further on, because if I do this bit first and then I put my hand on it to do the elephant, it's just going to be a mess. So let's first go in with my 2B pencil. I'm going in with my pencils now because we're doing the elephant and obviously there's a lot more detail, so the block it would be a bit harder to get all that detail. But I'm going to use the block a bit afterwards for the darkest areas, for example just on this side. But for now let's go and add in our 2B pencil. And again, let's start towards the top. You can see that there's a bit of shadow within the ear, and once again I'm just doing this to the darkest parts. And we will be going and doing all of the little creases. When you do your initial sketch outline, try and include the shapes of all of the darkest shadows. Try and add some detail into your sketch outline. Main value changes and stuff like that. Let's move on to the eye, just looking closely. This whole side is pretty dark. Remember, just focusing on the darkest areas for now. The shadow continues towards the ear. So this step is pretty straightforward. Just look at the reference section at a time, look at each area, identify the darkest sections within that area, and then just go ahead and shade in some of this 2B pencil. So once again, outlining around the tusk. And shading in the really dark shadow just below it that continues towards the leg. You can see that the shadow really does expand throughout this whole area, leading on towards the trunk. Going around the little sections of the trunk. Remember, you can pull up any highlights or little lighter areas that you need to within these shadowed areas later with the Tombow Mono Eraser. As you will see, I do jump around a little bit as I notice things. If you ever have a reference and you find that it really doesn't have too much contrast, but you love the reference and you really want to use it, then you can just edit the photo yourself. And when you edit it, just hype up the contrast a bit and just tweak the reference, edit it before you draw it. Not all the time references make for the best drawings. Sometimes you will have to tweak it a little bit to make it the best reference possible. Don't be afraid to adjust references to make them suit your needs a bit better. Adding a lot of shadow on this side. You really can't see too much detail by the eye. So I've added shading all throughout that area. Once again, I'm going to go around the tusks very carefully. You will have clean edges wherever something's overlapping something else. So for example, the tusk is overlapping with the leg and with the ear, so there is going to be a clean edge separating those areas. Whereas you'll have gradients throughout an area where you can see the whole thing. For example, this ear, we can see the whole ear, so there are value changes, but they will have more of a transition to them. Okay, let's move on to the ear and just shade in some of these darkest areas. We will be softening all of this out with a brush later on, so don't worry. You can be quite sketchy at this stage. You're really just blocking in these values. Right at the edge of the ear it's a little bit darker, so just adding a bit of shading there. Now once again I'm just going to go around the side of the trunk. Just add all of this value, but I'm not going to shade it completely because then when I want to go over here I might accidentally smudge it. So I'm going to jump straight back over to the actual trunk of the elephant now and start to get in some of these creases. You don't have to worry about getting smooth edges because as you can see quite a lot of the creases are quite jagged. In fact it's better to have little jerky lines as you're doing this to get a more natural, realistic look. And remember the creases are not just in like there for no reason, they're going in a specific direction, they're curving around a specific part and they're really, really important, so make sure you focus on getting in the texture around the elephant. All of the little subtle ones as well. They are quite dark. I'm getting in the darkest ones to start off with. And then we can go and get in the more subtle ones, the subtle shading using our 2H one. Because remember that's for more subtle details, it's harder so it's lighter. So I am going to be continuing to go throughout this whole section. It will take a little while. I always do find that this whole stage does take the longest amount of time, but it really is worth it for the final result. It really does give a really nice result. So we can't actually see a really like defined edge around the trunk. It actually all just kind of joins in with the grooves, the creases in the trunk. So now because we've moved further down, I can start to get in the shadows for the body of the elephant. All of this is very, very dark, so I'm just going to shade all of this in. Do a nice edge there. Also adding more shadow on this side of the leg. And also adding all of the little creases on the legs over here. Once again, looking at how the creases curve around the legs. Adding a lot of shading on the bottom of the foot now. Once again, it's all quite dark, and you can see just how much of these darker pencils we really are having to add. And this might scare you. Maybe you're not used to adding this much dark shadow to start off with. It is very intimidating, but don't worry. Just use this exercise to really practice your contrast. It is a very extreme piece for contrast, but I think those types of pieces are the best for really practicing. There's a lot of shadow right at the bottom of the trunk. You can't really see too much value change between the bottom of the trunk and the foot. Particularly there's shadow more on this right hand side. It is still dark on the left hand side, but it's a little bit of a lighter value. Adding some more creases on the bottom of the trunk. And now you can see that some of the foot goes behind the trunk, and that is a bit lighter in value, but on the right hand side of the foot it's a lot darker, so let's shade that in. We can also see some more creases. Some are thicker than others, so look at the thickness of the creases. You really want a good variety here. You don't want all of the creases to be the same thickness, the same length, the same direction. You want to have a nice variety because that is what's going to make it look more natural. I'm going to go back through on the ear and just add a little bit more shadow. Remember, we still have got to go in with our 2H on the actual elephant. And so now I want to move back onto my charcoal block, and I'm going to continue to do this horizon here. So because the clouds were going in this direction, kind of going towards the middle, I did it in that direction, but the actual horizon is very flat. So I'm going horizontally. I'm not going at an angle. I'm going with the direction, which is just flat. So I'm going horizontal. It's not just a straight line, there is a little bit of bump there. So I like to give it a bit of a natural sort of curve to it. I am also going to miss out some of the highlights, and I'm also going to miss it out at little sections just to give some little highlights peeping through. I'm going to connect it with the actual elephant. There is this brighter highlight which I am going to just work around. And I'm going to switch over to the 2B as I get into these more detail areas just to make it a little bit easier. Just try and make everything easier on yourself as you go through this process. So if you're trying to do a really small, tight area, switch over to using the pencil. It's going to make it easier for you. If you're doing a large area, switch over to using the actual block. So moving on to this side, just going to repeat the same thing. There's a few more highlights over in this section. You can add them after, but the brightest ones, it's better to preserve them because there's only so light we can get it if we're using the erasing technique. Switching over to the pencil to really focus in on these tighter areas. And to go around the side of the elephant. So to get a good contrast, you generally want lighter areas and lighter values to be next to darker values to make each of them pop. So to make a highlight really pop, match it next to a darker value. For example, if you're drawing an animal with, for example, white fur, then it would be a good idea to make the background a little bit darker. Because if you were doing a white animal, a white fur, against a white background, then the animal isn't really going to stand out because there's not much contrast there. There's not much of a difference between the actual animal and the background. So it's all just going to merge in together. Whereas if you did, for example, a white wolf and you did it against a darker brown background or a green background, it's going to stand out a lot more because there's more of a contrast there. And so if you really want your drawing to pop, have a good contrast. You can see at the moment this has got really high contrast because it's either white or black, so it's really going to pop out. But it won't look as realistic if we left it this way because it needs all the values. But it does pop out. It really does pop at the moment. So there is a little bit of this shadow just under the feet, and I'm going to look throughout the ground now and look for some of the darkest shadows. And because the ground has got this very rough texture to it, I'm not going to try and be ultra smooth. I actually want some of the texture from the pencil to show through, some of the grittiness. So I'm generally just going to sketch it in some of these darkest areas. Sometimes you don't want to overblend areas. Sometimes areas do need to have texture to them and need to be sketchy to have a more realistic texture. Okay. So now I'm going to go in with my 2H pencil and we're going to focus back to the elephant and just get in some of these shadows that are dark but aren't quite as dark as the 2B. For example, on the top of the head here, you can see there's this very dark section in the center of the elephant's head, but it wasn't as dark as the shadows over here, so we didn't need the 2B. Also, the elephant's skin isn't going to be ultra smooth, so we can, let a bit more of the grittiness of the pencil show through, and that will give a more realistic texture. So we could actually just go ahead and fill in all of the other areas using this pencil and not even have to really blend anything. You can see that I am using the side of the pencil as I do this to help me cover a larger area quicker. And to make sure that I'm not pressing too hard on the pencil, because for example if we did need to erase any areas to get some highlights, then if we really press hard into the pencil, it's going to make it a lot harder to go and actually erase. Whereas if we're very nice and light, it's definitely going to make it easier. So the whole of this bottom section of the ear has got more of a shadow tone to it, so I'm just going to lightly shade some of this 2H over this whole area. So for example here, because we've added a bit of it to the whole area, if we do want to lighten up some areas later on, it's good that we've just used the side of the pencil. So I'm going to add quite a bit of shading within the trunk, especially over those creases to transition them into the lighter areas, and on the left hand side of the trunk. I do want to thicken up some of these creases as well, and so it's not just going from that 2B value to a really white value, just add a bit of a transition in there. Creating some little scribbly motions just to add a bit more texture within each section. Just going in loose circles really does help to add a bit more texture. Adding some more shading on this ear this time. Going over where our 2B pencil is, once again to transition out of values. Even if it's a fairly harsh transition, it's always best to make some sort of transition. If we can see the whole of an area, then it's never going to be a really, like, there's never not going to be a transition if we can see the whole of an area. So there's quite a bit of shadow just above this eye on the right hand side here. I'm going to add a little bit of shading on the whole of this leg, and a lot more shading on this section, because even though it isn't as dark as our darkest shadows over here, it's a very subtle difference. I'm going to add even more shading on the right hand side of the trunk. Do want to thicken up some of these main creases. So I'm nearly coming to the end of adding the shading on the elephant for now. I'm really happy with how it's looking so far. Just looking around each area in turn and seeing if I need to tweak anything else before we blend it out. Well, before we move on, actually, I do want to add this a little bit somewhere else. I'm going to switch back over briefly to the 2B pencil. I do want to add a bit more just on this side. So I'm thickening up some of these main creases. Okay, so now the last thing that I want to do before we blend it out is take that 2H pencil and I want to very lightly shade it just across the ground. And I might actually switch over to the 2B pencil because I really do want a gritty, sketchy look for this. So I'm definitely going to be using the side of the pencil. Actually, now I'm going to switch back over. And I want it to be quite textured, because as you can see in the reference, it is very textured. So I'm adding a light layer everywhere to start off with. Like I said, just using the side of the pencil. Once again, I know it's a horrible sound, actually I'll just mute you guys whilst I fill in the rest of this. Okay, now I've got a basic layer over the whole area. I'm going to go in and add another layer on the darkest areas. So I'm going to keep building up more and more layers, still being very sketchy. We go in circular motions. Just want to get a more ground-like texture. You can create darker patches in a few areas. Vary your pressure to, again, increase variety. Some areas are a little bit smoother, so you can just go with the direction and apply a bit more pressure to get that smoother look. Mainly in the distance as it meets that horizon. Also, as we get towards the sides, they are a little bit more blurred out. So we will be softening over them with a brush a little bit more. Now I'm going to go in a little bit with the 2B pencil and just add this on some of the darker areas or any areas where we want to add a bit more texture. Or to transition a bit more out of the horizon. So anyway guys, that's pretty much it for this first part. In the first part I just wanted to block in all of the main structure of the elephant using our charcoal pencils, and so in the next part we're going to be working on blending all of this out using a few different techniques. So I'll see you in the next part. Bye everybody.